Hey guys, how's it going? So for this video, I'm really looking forward to discussing and analyzing the 6th episode of Season 4 of Better Call Saul entitled Piñata. This is a very detail-oriented and intricate episode that was primarily devoted to character as well as plot development, which at the same time also provided us with one of the most intense and darkest scenes to end an episode that has ever been presented to us over the entire course of Better Call Saul. So without further delay, let's jump right into this review for episode 6. Okay, so the cold opening scene of this episode presented us with a flashback scene to the days when Jimmy and Kim both worked in the mailroom at HHM, which very notably also contained the appearance of the late Charles McGill. During this scene, we saw Jimmy and Kim make the rounds and distribute mail to the employees of HHM and also engage in some casual conversation, which was then interrupted by the staff of HHM praising and congratulating Chuck on a prominent legal case that he had just won. Following Jimmy inquiring to Kim what was so significant about this case, Kim then proceeded to give Jimmy the legal details regarding this case, to which we saw Jimmy really seem to take no real interest in or even seem to grasp. Then, following this conversation with Jimmy, Kim then briefly spoke to Chuck and congratulated him herself on this legal victory and also discussed the very intricate details of this case with Chuck, as she had attempted to do to a lesser degree with Jimmy. Then, following the end of Kim's conversation with Chuck, this scene would then finally culminate with Jimmy deciding to enter the HHM library. So while in the grand scheme of things this scene was fairly tame as far as opening scenes go for Better Call Saul, in my opinion, based on the context of this scene, it appears that the reason that the creators of Better Call Saul decided to open this episode in this fashion was in order to display the precise moment that first sparked Jimmy's interest in potentially becoming a lawyer, which I think we can also assume from the context of this scene was originally as a result of Jimmy wanting to connect and relate with Kim on a deeper level. Following this scene, Act 1 of this episode then opened with a scene of Kim up late at night, continuing her work for Mesa Verde, which also continued to display the theme of Kim's plot this season, where we saw that her focus during this scene seemed to be preoccupied with her PD cases instead of her work for Mesa Verde. So, taking that into account, this scene would then also display Kim coming across a sleeping Jimmy, where she discovered from Jimmy's doodles on a notepad his apparent desire to eventually start up Wexler McGill again once he gets his law license back. But that being said, as we would see over the entire course of this episode, the respective desires of Jimmy and Kim in the end would not be on the same page in regards to how they saw their respective immediate legal futures. Following this revelation, this scene would then pick up the next morning with Jimmy and Kim, which contains some dialogue where Jimmy explained to Kim his reasoning for why he changed his mind in regards to seeing a therapist, which in the end, Jimmy stated was as a result of this type of therapy just not being for him, and that he essentially just wanted to keep moving forward in life and keep looking ahead as opposed to looking back and reflecting. That being said, following some further prying by Kim into why in the end Jimmy made this decision, in a manner which indicated that she ultimately wanted Jimmy to see this therapist, she nonetheless, in the end, met Jimmy's ultimate decision with absolute support and continued to display nothing but unconditional support towards Jimmy throughout this entire grieving process. Following this scene, the next scene in this act then picked up with Kim at Schweigert and Coakley, where following some small talk with Rich Schweigert, where he thanks Kim again for sending Bill Atwood their way following her car accident and all of the business that this referral brought them, Kim's dialogue in the scene with Rich regarding the banking division of Schweigert and Coakley would as a result end up foreshadowing what might have been the most important plot as well as character development scene that would occur between Jimmy and Kim this season at the end of Act 2. Following this scene, the third and final scene of this act then picked up with Mike and Gus at what looked like to be an enormous airplane hangar of some kind, where we heard Mike discuss with Gus the living arrangements and accommodations for Ziegler's German crew that would be working on the super lab in total secrecy. Following Mike discussing these living arrangements for these men at this unknown secret location, his conversation with Gus would then be interrupted by Tyrus, who briefly spoke with Gus and stated that a person unknown to the audience had an infection and a bad one at that, which at the time, based on the context of this season, was either likely Nacho or Hector, but due to the fact that Nacho was noticeably absent from this episode of Better Call Saul for the second consecutive week, we eventually learned that this infection belonged to Hector, which as a result caused Gus to abruptly leave Mike in order to check on the health status of his primary antagonist. And with all that being said, this scene between Mike and Gus would at the end of the day end up foreshadowing the plots of these respective characters that would ensue over the course of this episode. Following the conclusion of Act 1, Act 2 of this episode then presented us with one long continuous scene that first opened with Jimmy back at work at CC Mobile, where he received a phone call from the nephew of Mrs. Strauss, the woman who starred in his unauthorized Sandpiper Crossing commercial for Davison, Maine, who stated to Jimmy that she had recently passed away and asked Jimmy if he could help him and his family discern the intricacies of the will that he did for her. However, due to the fact that Jimmy cannot legally practice the law at this moment, he referred this man to HHM. That being said, following the end of this conversation, we saw that this death really seemed to have a strong impact on Jimmy, who following this conversation went home to watch the commercial that he made with Mrs. Strauss. However, this brief viewing of this commercial was then ultimately interrupted by a phone call from Kim, who invited him to lunch, where she stated to him the revelation that she intended to take a job as a partner with Schweigert and Coakley due to the vast resources that their firm had in order to help her with Mesa Verde, which would also as a result free her up to work on her pro bono PD overflow work as well. That being said, this statement was of course met with absolute confusion by Jimmy, who was also rather flabbergasted upon discovering that Kim was doing pro bono PD overflow work, which Kim responded by stating to Jimmy that she had really enjoyed this type of work and also that this work gave her a large amount of personal fulfillment and satisfaction. Following this revelation, this would then lead to the very important scene of Jimmy leaving the table for a moment and walking towards the kitchen of the restaurant, where we could see Jimmy almost appear to be hyperventilating and looking completely and utterly distressed upon hearing this revelation by Kim, which in the end appeared to close the door on Wexler McGill ever starting up again once Jimmy gets his law license back. Furthermore, I think that based on the opening scene that was displayed to us in this episode, where it was implied that Jimmy's decision to be a lawyer in many ways was driven by wanting a connection with Kim, also led to an increase in the pain that Jimmy felt in this scene following this rejection by Kim. That being said, while in the end Jimmy would return to the table and supportively tell Kim to take this job offer as if this quasi-panic attack did not occur, nonetheless, based on the initial reaction Jimmy displayed in this scene, I think we can assume that Jimmy was not being totally sincere in his response at all. So, taking all these details about this scene at the end of Act 2 into account, as stated previously, I think this might have been one of the most important plot as well as character development scenes regarding the relationship of Jimmy and Kim that has taken place so far this season, due to the fact that the light at the end of the tunnel of starting up Wexler McGill again had now been for all intents and purposes closed, which I think in many ways was the reason that caused Jimmy to act out in the manner that he did following this scene in the remaining scenes of this episode. That being said, what was also very notable about this conversation between Jimmy and Kim was the fact that both characters in this scene were not being completely truthful with one another, where Jimmy was clearly not 100% truthful about his true feelings regarding Kim's professional career, and Kim was not completely sincere in regards to how she acquired this job from Schweigert and Coakley, where she omitted the fact that this job offer was actually more of her idea, which I think would have hurt Jimmy even more if he knew that Kim was very actively trying to get a job with a big prestigious law firm, while simultaneously knowing that Jimmy wanted to start up Wexler McGill again. And all that being said, as I have discussed in many of my previous videos, I think that the lack of transparency from both of these characters does not in any way bode well for their relationship in the final 4 episodes of this season. Following this long continuous scene in Act 2, Act 3 of this episode then opened with the scene that was teased to us prior to this episode of Mike visiting Stacy at her home in the aftermath of Mike's outburst at the support group meeting. That being said, at the end of the day, while in the aftermath of this event it appears that Mike won't be attending any more of these support group meetings in the future, based on everything we know about Mike's relationship with his family in the plot of Breaking Bad, it nonetheless seems that this slight rift that occurred at this meeting will not significantly affect Mike's relationship with his daughter-in-law and by extension granddaughter, due to the fact that we all know that Mike had a very active role in looking after his granddaughter over the course of Breaking Bad. Following this scene, the second scene in Act 3 then picked up with Jimmy at HHM, where we discovered that Jimmy went there to meet with Howard in order to get the money that is owed to him from Chuck's estate. However, very interestingly, prior to this meeting, Jimmy noticed that many of the cubicles at HHM were vacant, which upon inquiring from Howard after receiving this money, stated to Jimmy that HHM had been suffering from some financial setbacks as well as setbacks to their reputation, which is causing the firm some hard times. However, following this revelation by Howard, this was then met by Jimmy, who in a very Saul Goodman-like fashion then proceeded to rail against Howard in an insulting tirade and essentially told him to get his shit together and stop wallowing in his own misery and to save the firm's reputation. which in many ways reminded me of the scene where Saul spoke with Walt in season 3 of Breaking Bad in the episode entitled Green Light.
Okay, consider this an intervention. You could have been arrested back there. You understand. I mean, speaking as your lawyer, I'm always looking for billable hours. But speaking as your business associate, I'm strongly advising that you get your shit together.
So, taking all of these plot details about this scene into consideration, while I think this scene primarily showed us another glimpse into the foreshadowing of Jimmy's morphing personality, I also think the scene in many ways could possibly be foreshadowing the dissolution of HHM, and as a result, explain why Howard and HHM are not present in the plot of Breaking Bad. Following this scene, the third scene in Act 3 then presented us with what might have been my favorite scene of this season so far, where in true Saul Goodman fashion, Jimmy ended up spending Chuck's inheritance on a large bulk quantity of burner cell phones in order to resell them as he did in the previous episode, likely as a result of him realizing that his dreams of starting up Wexler McGill again would never take form. Then, following the montage scene where Jimmy stores these phones at the nail salon, this scene would then end up foreshadowing the scene that would take place at the end of this episode, where based on the context of this scene, we heard Jimmy speak on the phone with the vet Dr. Caldera regarding setting up the arrangements for Jimmy to get his revenge against the young man who mugged him in the previous episode. Following this scene, the last scene in Act 3 of this episode then presented us with the scene of Gus watching over Hector following the information he received from Tyrus regarding the status of his medical condition, which during this scene led Gus to speak with the unconscious Hector at the hospital and tell him a personal anecdote about his time growing up as a poor boy in Chile, which would in the end up being a metaphor for the plot of Gus Fring's revenge, which would ensue over the course of Breaking Bad, which personified the patience and tenacity of Gus of stopping at nothing to get his revenge against Hector and the cartel. Following the end of Act 3, Act 4 of this episode then opened with the scene of the German workers and Herr Ziegler arriving at the airplane hangar in order to be briefed by Mike on the parameters of their working arrangements, which as a side note also presented us with the first appearance of the actor Stefan Kabasik, who ended up portraying one of the German men who was hired to work on the construction of the Superlab. That being said, following Mike calling these men together in order to give them a rundown of the working and living situation, this action was notably met with insubordination from one of the workers named Kai. Following this action by this worker named Kai, this then led Herr Ziegler to reassuring Mike not to worry about these men and their initial misconduct and that they will be focused and not fool around once the work begins. That being said, following this conversation, Mike then went to the surveillance room and told the men watching the closed-circuit cameras to keep an eye on this man Kai as a result of him being rather recalcitrant during the scene. And with all of these plot details about this scene being taken into account, I will be very curious to see if Kai's actions in this scene are in fact foreshadowing anything specific in regards to Mike's relationship with these men in the plot of this season, and in the big picture, I am very excited to see what happens with this process of building the Super Lab in the coming episodes, which based on the plot that has ensued over the course of this season so far, really seems to exemplify the statement that Gus told Walt regarding the Super Lab in Season 3 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Moss, about the large amount of planning that went into constructing the Super Lab.
Quite a lot of planning went into this.
I would say so.
And finally, the last scene in this episode presented us with Jimmy getting his revenge against the three men who robbed him in the previous episode, which culminated with a very dark and twisted plot involving Huel as well as Man Mountain, who first appeared in the plot of Better Call Saul in Season 1 in the episode entitled Pimento, who in a very complex and intricate plot intimidated these men into not messing with Jimmy anymore by effectively turning them into human piñatas and made it seem as though they would be beaten to death for robbing Jimmy in the previous episode. And with all that being said, in my opinion, I thought this ending scene in this episode really encapsulated Jimmy's morphing personality, taking another giant leap forward, who I think in many ways acted more like Saul Goodman in this episode than any other episode of Better Call Saul so far, which in many ways was likely exacerbated due to the fact that the light at the end of the tunnel had closed for Jimmy in this episode of Wexler McGill ever starting up again, which in my opinion really caused Jimmy to lose all hope and really say fuck it and truly live life on his own terms and go down a path which will eventually lead him to becoming the attorney Saul Goodman, who really only looks out for himself and makes sure that he gets what he wants in life, even at the expense of everyone else, which I think will of course likely lead to some major rifts in his already teetering relationship with Kim, the last person on this earth who Jimmy cares about, in the remaining episodes of this season. And with all of these details about this plot being stated, at the end of the day, following everything that transpired over the course of this episode, in addition to this plot involving the main protagonist of Better Call Saul, I am also extremely excited to see what progress will be made with the other plots that have been presented to us over the course of this season as we head into these last 4 episodes, including what will the plot involving the construction of the super lab have in store for us following this episode, where will the plot of Gus and Hector go from here as a result of Hector finally regaining consciousness, which has been teased will take place in the next episode, what will be the ultimate fate of Howard Hamlin and HHM, and finally, when will we see the plot of Nacho and Lalo take place, which has yet to come into play as of the first 6 episodes of Season 4, all of which I am very much looking forward to seeing unfold over the course of these last 4 episodes. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and also make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos where I discuss and analyze the plot of Season 4. As always, my name is Anton Jackson. Thanks again for watching.